Hey CactusCon, Alex here to introduce our next two presenters. Yael Grauer, who's an investigative tech reporter and has written for Ars Technica, Wired, The Intercept, and others, and David Huerta, who's a digital security trainer at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Their talk is a retrospective of the worst cybersecurity reporting of 2020. Stick around after the talk, click the link for a live Q&A with David and Yael.
Hello, CactusCon. Welcome to our presentation. For any of you that saw us in 2019, you're in for a sequel. If cybersecurity in 2019 was so bad, why didn't they make the sequel? It turns out we did. So welcome to the worst of cybersecurity reporting 2020 edition. As you know, there was no CactusCon in 2020. And 2021 is a little bit early to be doing a retrospective on stories in 2021. So instead, we are going to discuss all the worst stories we can find in cybersecurity reporting in 2020. So who are we again? Yael, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Yael. I'm an investigative tech reporter. I cover online privacy and security. I've written for a bunch of different sites for a little bit over a decade. I also do talks on digital security and source protection, and I have a master's degree from Cronkite, which was kind of cool because it started right after DEF CON ended and then ended right before the next DEF CON. So I always joke that it was an interesting way to kill time between DEF CONs, but it's actually really true.
And I'm David. I'm a digital security trainer over at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, abbreviated FPF. Where we train journalists in how to use technology to keep their work safe, to keep their sources safe, to keep themselves safe. I've helped co-facilitate hundreds of trainings around the world, including co-facilitating the digital security track over at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Conference, which last year was co-facilitated with the National Association of Black Journalists. I also occasionally write, and I've written for Motherboard, The Outline, which doesn't really exist anymore, and FPF's own security blog, which you can check out at freedom.press. I did not graduate from ASU, but actually dropped out in order to start your friendly local neighborhood hackerspace, Heatsink Labs. All right, so welcome back to our online Zoom roast, as it were. So we're having a Zoom barbecue this year, but we still have lots to serve. Yeah, what kind of journalism do we have on the grill?
So today we're talking about writing. We're going to ignore all the worst of cybersecurity, television, radio, podcast, YouTube, TikTok, journalism.
Cool.
And just a few reminders, because it's easy. I think it's kind of easy for some people in the hacker community to sort of hate on journalism. Just because you read a bad article doesn't mean the author is a terrible writer and everything they write is horrible. There are bad writers, but that doesn't mean that the site they write for is always bad. And just because there's some bad sites doesn't mean that the entire industry is bad every time. So kind of what we want to do is help people get better. All we can do is our best, but we can always get better. We think it's important that there isn't misinformation spread by bad headlines and bad reporting. Just a reminder to follow the work of individual journalists who do great work. People bounce around a lot. There's always layoffs and people just switching jobs. So instead of saying like, oh, this publication is good or bad, you can follow the work of individuals who you think are good.
Very cool. So this first story that we're going to start with is not so much a cybersecurity story. We actually had to dig through a lot to find the sort of bad cybersecurity stories that we were able to share with you today. This one, though, happens to be a good example of some very kind of obvious mistakes and bad things that you should definitely not do as a journalist covering tech. So this is a story from the National Review. It is basically false. So this headline is actually wrong. It turns out Kamala Harris is not the Kamala Harris's former press secretary is not the face of Twitter censorship, and actually has nothing really to do with the authorization of, who to suspend or remove from the Twitter platform. In this case, the headline was not corrected. This was shared over 9,000 times on Twitter. And then only after that was a small correction kind of added at the end. We're going to be touching on corrections in kind of some of the other stories that we're going to talk about. And in this case, we have one. We have a correction here, but we don't have a corrected headline, which if anybody is familiar with the way people consume news on Twitter, people usually don't get beyond just the headline. Whoops. So there's a little bit about sort of how editorial processes and how, the different processes that go into fixing things after they're published go into play that are not necessarily as fast moving or as iterative as, something we might be used to dealing with in tech and security. Whereas if as a software engineer, I were to fix an issue that was causing bugs, I would, create a fork of the repository, create a pull request, argue with the maintainer, maybe get it merged. Journalism is a little bit different where, there are sort of changes that get made in post if something is discovered to be unfactual. And in some cases, a note saying like, hey, this is a big thing that we changed, so here's a note on what we changed. This is different from the original. So if a fact in the story is wrong, that fact should be corrected. If the entire premise of the story, that story should be retracted, which is to say just like thrown in the dumpster, which is on fire because 2020. And in this case, the premise of the story is false. This should have been a retraction. So let's talk about what went wrong. Like, how do these things happen? So back in Idaho, when I was a young lad, I worked at a grocery store as my first job. And the owner of the grocery store, Rick, used to have this saying as I was like learning the ropes of having a job for the first time. And he was like, David, never assume it makes an ass out of you and me. And I think that's a valuable lesson to learn in journalism, but also just kind of everything in life, just in general. And it would help if writers would not assume things that turn out to be very false without actually fact checking them first. And then there's also the issue of just like not everybody that writes things on the internet is going to be super well versed in journalistic ethics or, just general practices and norms. Also, though, Twitter's not exactly making this easy. There is a lot of opacity into like how the bird side works, how decisions get made, who makes them. There's not a lot of transparency there. Speaking from personal experience, I've had a Twitter account suspended with an email saying that I had one of my tweets violated the terms of service. This was an account with 0 tweets in it. I logged in from Linux. Apparently, Twitter doesn't like that. So there's, a lot that is unknown about how things work there. It would be cool if we knew more. All right, and Yael, you have a story for us here.
Yes, next up is we have this Haaretz story, which is talking about Signal and how Celebrite can break into it even though it's encrypted. This was actually Celebrite already had access to people's unlocked phones, and it was talking about how to like pull that data and organize it, basically. And so obviously there's a difference between if you have somebody's unlocked phone and can read their messages, or if you can, remotely decrypt all Signal messages. And the article didn't really explain that. So that was really annoying for people freaking out about Signal being broken. And then after Haaretz wrote this story, BBC broke the same story. Pretty similar, but made it worse. They just, Celebrate claimed to have cracked chat apps encryption. And it's like, what does cracking encryption actually mean? And if you read the article, they have this quote, according to one cybersecurity expert, the claim sounded believable. That's not reporting. Like, you have to actually look at data, not just like this person said this sounded plausible. And then obviously make a distinction between like, are you decrypting intercepted messages, or are you like, do you have somebody's unlocked phone? And it wasn't just BBC that bandwagoned on Haaretz's story. There was other people who did too. And you can see a lot of edits saying like, oh, psych. But it's just really good to kind of look into these things ahead of time instead of jumping into it when a lot of people are talking about it. Because sometimes you have misinformation. And Arts kind of later wrote a story saying like, psych. But I don't know, like it's kind of an important thing that you want to get right the first time. And obviously that's easier said than done. I've had errors in stories. I think most journalists have, but for something as important as that could really like affect Signal users who are using it for sensitive information, I think it's really important to kind of understand what you're talking about a little bit better. So what went wrong? So yeah, there was claims from Cellbrite. They weren't put into the appropriate context. And you know, it's hard being a tech reporter because even if you know a lot about one type of tech, you might not know about another area of it. But in this case, it's very important to kind of explain the difference between encryption and rest or in transit. We also saw that, like I saw that Signal had written a blog post, but it was after both of these sites had written stories, and I wonder if they could have done it more preemptively. And then again, like people with huge followings could avoid bandwagoning or a little bit, maybe wait to get more clear information. But what if you are concerned about someone taking your phone? So I will turn it back to David.
Thanks, Yale. So yeah, I think this is, you know, a subject that I talk about a lot with journalists because Signal is like very much a staple in the kind of digital security toolkit that we tend to recommend. In this case, just to kind of clear how this all works, tools like those made by companies like Cellbrite, like GreatKey, try to get into your phone by unlocking it. And they do so by trying to unlock your phone through whatever passcode you set to it. And they know that most people choose very common and predictable passcodes to the point that they will use, you know, what most of you may be familiar with, a dictionary attack, using known passcodes that have been used in previous finds on other phones, essentially. So you have basically this giant list of known used passcodes that they run through to see if there's a match and then unlock the phone if there is one. And that is why we generally recommend opting for something that is randomly generated, long, or even better yet, instead of going with a numeric passcode, going with an alphanumeric passcode. There's also some, you know, there may be some use cases for things like the biometrics, but at the same time, there's also some Fifth Amendment protections to think about as you're like balancing those two options. We have a little bit about that on our website at freedom.press with a sort of guidebook on mobile security written by my colleague, Martin Shelton. And Signal has another feature that I think isn't really super well known, but I think is really great, and that is disappearing messages. This can help sort of automate being able to like cull all Signal messages in a conversation so that if somebody does seize your phone and use one of these forensics tools on it, they would only be able to access, you know, a certain recent amount of chats in a conversation. This has to be set per conversation. It's something that like both parties on the line, so to speak, have to agree with in terms of like whether to keep messages around for like a day or a week, for example. And Signal in this case has some support documentation to help you get started. You can go to support.signal.org. We have a link here and you can kind of look for how to turn on that feature in your device. Cool. So we have a article here that I want to talk about, in this case from the New York Times. So at the very beginning of a lot of the TikTok discourse that we kind of ran into, I was expecting to see a lot more FUD, a lot more fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and a lot of bad reporting to come out of this. Fortunately for the world and unfortunately for this presentation, most of the writing around that actually turned out to be pretty good. Maybe they saw or heard about our talk from 2019 and decided they really don't want to end up on this presentation, in which case then we'll just give ourselves a high five. That is to say, though, that, you know, there are some things that could be improved in this. We'll talk a little bit about this paragraph, which is not actually the original. There's a mention of WeChat in this case, in addition to kind of the main discourse about TikTok. most of which is actually pretty good in terms of making sure to get your facts straight, making sure that people have talked to experts. There's a few issues with this original kind of paragraph in WeChat, and that is kind of the mischaracterization of who actually uses WeChat. So in this case, we had a American official kind of cited as, being the source for this kind of description. And in this case, your source might not always be the best at understanding the usage of apps that they don't use themselves. And it's a good thing to, get a second opinion from people that actually do use those apps, for example, or that do use the technology that you're writing about in general. It doesn't have to be specific to any one app. And it's not a unique issue in journalism. We see this all the time in cybersecurity, InfoSec, where we don't necessarily understand the way non-techie people use computers, and that can lead to a number of different problems in terms of security recommendations, in terms of the design of these systems as they're being built, for example. So this is a teachable moment basically for all of us. And in this case, the New York Times isn't like short of those resources. They have an entire like skyscraper in New York City full of people who are like experts in all variety of fields. They're not actually in the building right now, of course, because of COVID, but I'm sure they have a Slack channel where they can talk to somebody that would know about, people using apps in China and how people are using WeChat. In this case, the reality of that being that it's not so much something that is being used by only software engineers in Silicon Valley talking to friends back home, but also by like literally anybody that wants to talk to somebody in China. There's also, this issue of just like where's the correction statement on this article? And Yael, you have some thoughts on this, I think.
Yeah, I actually led a discussion to talk about the ethics of correction. So the New York Times is one of the publications that will sometimes kind of quietly make changes without necessarily publishing a correction. And different sites have different kind of rules around it. But some of them will say, like, if it's a minor error, you can just change it without putting a correction notice. The reason to put a correction notice is because if you don't, it's sort of like gaslighting sometimes, where people are like, I could have sworn that this article described this user group in this way, and now it's not there, and having to kind of comb back through Twitter screenshots or whatever. But I think a lot of times publications and even reporters have trouble admitting when they made an error. And are less likely to want to have an error notice because it just highlights like all the things they got wrong. And in a time where people are kind of doubting the credibility of media and attacking journalists for making mistakes, it's not as easy to just be like, oh yeah, look, I had these 5 mistakes in my story. And so I think the bar for putting a correction notice is higher than it could be. And then sometimes like a writer will say like, oh, I had an error, can we fix this? Or maybe it was an editor error. And some editors won't even, make those changes. So yeah, it's kind of dependent on, and a lot of times people will think something needs to be corrected when, maybe it doesn't. Maybe they're wrong, or maybe it's a matter of opinion, or maybe there's debate on it. There's not like hard data that it's incorrect. So personally, I think like my biggest thing is that changes should get corrected. And if that means like if it lowers the bar for those changes to be made, if they don't put a correction notice, I don't personally have a huge problem with it. But yeah, it depends on the publication. Like most of them will put a correction notice if you misspell a proper noun or make a major factual error. And then we talked earlier about how like if the entire premise is wrong, just take the piece down is my opinion for the ethical way to handle that.
Cool. So, just going back to what went wrong, there is, sometimes a disconnect between journalists and the people they write about, in some cases, maybe not understanding the way people use tech outside of, their own circles. Again, we have the same issue in InfoSec. We, could use some time talking to people who are not like us, who are not like knee deep in the weeds of security all the time, that may end up, kind of demonstrating that maybe we don't understand the way other people understand technology. and that might give us, some insight into, other issues and problems that we might not have thought about to address. One example that I listed here is, is the recommendation for signal, for example, something that we do regularly in a lot of digital security trainings and would make sense for most of the journalists that we train here where I am now in kind of New York City and in that area. Wouldn't necessarily map out too well in a place like China where you cannot download Signal easily because it's not listed in the App Store.
Okay, so the next the next roast is this Fast Company story about voting via smartphone, which everybody's really obsessed with the pandemic. Like they really want to do stories about how like we could vote over the internet or phone. And this story was about a company called Votes, and it was about how 2020 was the first ever presidential election where people cast their vote by smartphone. And I've reported on Votes a lot, so I know a lot of information on it, and I was kind of stunned by this article. Actually, there was a similar article in the Information which had a panel. It wasn't a Fast Company article, it was an Information article, but they had a panel on online voting with the author of that article, and it included a panelist from the company and didn't have any questions about Votes sending personal information to third parties without user notice or consent, which is something that they could have found out by doing research on the company before inviting them on a panel or writing a story about them. Votes was notoriously kicked off of a bug bounty because they turned a student researcher over to the state officials who contacted the FBI. And they tried to say, like, we didn't contact the FBI and kind of hedge about that, but it became pretty clear what they were doing. They also went to the Supreme Court. I think they filed like a brief with the Supreme Court because they decided that they don't actually like, they actually do like the CFAA, so they don't actually want to work with researchers even though they claim to. They also retroactively changed their bug bounty terms to make it look like this researcher had broken the terms. But luckily HackerOne has, like, you can actually see like these retroactive changes and when they were made. And they were eventually like kicked off that bug bounty. So this is all stuff that the writers of the story, and it's not just Fast Company, could like kind of research and dig into a little bit. There's also a NASM report representing the consensus of experts in elections. They're like, it is not secure to have marked ballots over the internet right now. There's so much research on it, and that's one of the reports that is kind of good background reading if you're going to write a story about this. And then, of course, there's an MIT report on the security vulnerabilities in Votes' app, and you can read that entire report publicly available. Votes tried to say that the report wasn't, well, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but Votes basically tried to say like, oh, these researchers don't know what they're talking about, and then their findings were corroborated by Trail of Bits, which Votes and another group, I think it was Tusk, like hired. So it's just stuff that was kind of missing or glossed over. Like, oh, these researchers said this, but never mind. And yeah, the headline was wrong, and there's a correction, but it doesn't actually address the headline. It just says like, oh, by the way, Votes' use in Brazil elections was just an experiment. It wasn't actually tabulated. Sorry about that. But yeah, there's more, and they had a quote saying, election officials who use this say they're no riskier than the current methods we use for some special cases of voting. That's not, like, obviously if election officials are using something, they would say like, oh yeah, this is perfectly safe. And then they, though several experts had voiced concerns, administrators say this is more time and cost effective and no riskier than voting in person. So when somebody makes a claim like that, that's when you have to see if they're telling the truth or what the data shows, which just wasn't done. It's not like a he said, she said, or he said, if there's actual data that you can turn to instead of making it a both sides type story. Oh yeah, and they quoted Amelia Powers Gardner, who is one of the election officials, and she actually got campaign funds from the CEO of Overstock, who dumped $10 million into Votes. So it's kind of worth looking into, like, is there a conflict of interest? Does this person have a vested interest in supporting this company? And is that why they're basically slandering researchers and overlooking like hard data that's consistent? Oh yeah, they wrote, Votes published a report addressing each of these supposed flaws. which said it was in the interest of public transparency. So yeah, they published a report that addressed the flaws that were found. This quote makes it sound like they're not real. But again, MIT found these flaws, and a company that votes helped pay for found the same flaws. So these flaws, these supposed flaws, were found by two different research teams. And you have to actually read through the report before saying like, oh, it's great for public transparency. Because if you read the actual report, you'll see that Votes' response to many of the flaws it found was, we accept the risk, essentially on behalf of the voters, which is pretty unacceptable. And you have to kind of, I don't know, I feel like you can't not read these reports. Like, it's boring and it's time consuming and you have to make a lot of phone calls to kind of verify them. But if you just kind of skip over them and be like, oh, these flaws are supposed and these researchers are wrong without digging into it, you end up writing like a fluff piece that's inaccurate. So what went wrong? Much more research should have been done to surface issues, or even just a little bit would have surfaced some of them, with votes, with electronic voting, current voting standards, etc. If you're going to quote somebody, maybe do a little bit of research on who those people are and what their interest is in the topic at hand, and then just don't assume that experimental votes are for real votes. Is a kind of it seems obvious to me, but apparently isn't always obvious. So in general, what can we do better as journalists and security researchers in 2021? Because I feel like it's a constant practice and you're constantly trying to improve and get better. For journalists, like, you want to fact check your assumptions, and that can be kind of difficult because sometimes you don't realize you're making an assumption, and then afterwards you're like, oh, I didn't even think to double check that, because I just assumed it was true. And then you want to make corrections, whether there's a correction notice or not. Like, figure out how to get your editors to make changes, assuming that you couldn't avoid making those errors in the first place, because errors happen. And so that's really important, is to make sure to fess up when you make a mistake and try to get it fixed. And if you're writing about an app and you kind of have a statement that you heard about, like, the type of people who use it, maybe check if that's true with the actual users. And if you're quoting somebody, kind of dig into who they are, make sure they're credible, and see whether they have conflicts of interest. So the do nots kind of goes back to what David said about assuming. So don't do that. And don't kind of gloss over security concerns and product. I guess this is kind of a twofer, because it's like, if there are actual security concerns, you don't want to kind of gloss them over and be like, oh, this isn't a big deal. It's whatever. It's an assumption, these supposed concerns. But then at the same time, if everybody's screaming about how the sky is falling and like encryption is broken, you also want to make sure you understand the context before sharing that information. So kind of trying to avoid those two extremes and doing the necessary research and conversations and kind of grunt work ahead of time to avoid making these errors that I'll get you in this presentation is a really good idea.
And of course, we also have some do's and don'ts for security researchers. We do recommend telling journalists about security issues and products they're reporting on. And this can be in the context of being a source that's kind of on background with the journalist to discover, what is going on in a particular product or industry, or in the context of just letting people know in their mentions being, by the way, this was found in this issue, because not everybody is going to know all the things you know. There's also, helping journalists understand which situations of vulnerability actually matters in, because not all situations are the same. We talked a little bit about this last year, for example, with the juice jacking story that got a lot of press, but in reality was maybe not the thing people should be worried about compared to the thing that is, what people are concerned about and the way that hacking actually happens in the real world. The do nots. In this case, maybe we want to avoid bug bounties for companies that turn researchers over to the cops. There are many wonderful projects with bug bounties that will not lead to an interrogation with the FBI. there's also, something to avoid is also bandwagoning in claims that are really sensationalists, such as, but not limited to, signal encryption is broken. And it's a good idea to understand in what context this claim is being made. And in the case of Celebrite, for example, they did have a blog post explaining what they actually did at the technical level, and people that were in security research could have just saw that post and realized, hey, this actually does not break signals encryption, which is generally meant to say the signal protocol, but actually just has to do with the way they keep, the local SQL database of messages inside the app.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So just some just to get to the point of a lot of these things, it's best to get correct information as soon as possible. Journalists putting out accurate stories and hackers responding to misinformation before it gets amplified. Corrections still have to be made sometimes, and it should be corrected up to and including retracting an entire story if necessary. Again, don't assume, because it makes an ass of you and me, that your experience with an app or tool or a user base that uses these tools or devices is reflective of the whole story. Definitely, avoid, in this case, half-heartedly getting both sides isn't good enough. We, do quote people to get different perspectives on a story, but we also want to make sure that they're not lying to you. And looking at actual data helps you figure that out. Also, doing research on the people you're speaking with, checking for conflict of interests, other issues that may taint their legitimacy or their, I guess, authenticity, I should say, or whether or not they're lying. That's kind of the point of a lot of these steps. But sometimes people lie to you, and the point of journalism is to get to the truth. It's important to put cybersecurity issues in context. For journalists, this requires reaching out to multiple experts. Yes, it means asking them dumb questions over and over and over again, or at least maybe questions that they've heard a lot. For hackers, this means being clear and specific and nuanced about these threats, and being clear about when they matter, when they don't, and being just as good as you can be at explaining a situation, knowing that they're not going to know all the different caveats that you're thinking about as you're understanding the situation. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in, I guess, a chat or whatever thing that we're going to use for that when this video goes live. Otherwise, feel free to drop us a line. We can be reached at these email addresses.
Thank you for coming on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.